Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Intifada Chic, Social Conformity and the Book of Job. In a society ruled by mimetic desire, everyone shares in making existence as barren as the desert, but no one is aware of it. As in well-ordered societies, people only do what they see done around them. The more the desert stretches within us and beyond us, the more we are tempted to blame reality or God himself, or, worse still, our neighbour, the first Job who comes along. Rene Girard, Job, the victim of his people. Hi everybody. And I recorded this video at the moment, so we're talking the beginning of October 2025. The UK is in the height of political protest season. There are marches through most major cities in the UK all the time now. And this image stuck with me. And I was going to explore some of the ideas behind it, building upon the work I'd previously done on Rene Girard in the Charlie Kirk themed video. But this has various elements that I find intriguing. So there's the obvious, blatant cognitive dissonance of the subject matter of the actual banner. There's also the patented raised arm of protest movements worldwide. And then my particular favourite is the two faces on the right. If you wanted to personify and encapsulate smug, self-righteous expression, I would suggest you would find that those faces difficult to beat. So one of the elements of the Book of Job, and I find it fascinating, I think it was written, they debate it, but they reckon potentially 540-ish BC onwards, and it was written in, people have added to it, it's written in stages, so it's quite controversial, well, not controversial, but it's debated when it was actually first authored. So you're talking, though, 2,500 years or thereabouts, and yet there are elements of the Book of Job, and this is the theme of the playlist, An Agnostic Guide to the Bible, where when you're struggling to make sense of the apparent madness of the world around us at the moment, going back to things like the Bible as a text just for exploring human wisdom, as it was documented more than 2 millennia ago, I find it incredibly useful, because, to quote Ecclesiastes, you realise that there is nothing new under the sun. This has all been seen before, and it will come to pass again, if to pastiche biblical type language. But this also interests me because, having, as I mention every time I start a video, recovering academic, it brings home to me, so I've got experience having taught a lot of undergraduates. So in the UK, that's ranging from the ages of 18 to 22-ish, roughly. Obviously, people come to university slightly later and so on, but roughly 18 to 22. And then I supervise PhD students who tended to be early 20s to late 20s. So I think I have quite a good handle, and they were the elite, so it was a good university I taught at. You're probably talking the top 5, there was a Russell Group university, so you're talking the top 5-10% of all the university students, and university students themselves are supposedly, not so much anymore, but the educational elite of any given population. So I was teaching very bright, supposedly well-educated youngsters, and yet the holes in their knowledge, which is fine, you go to university to learn things, but there seemed to be almost an inverse relationship between the strength of feeling over certain issues and the amount they actually knew of the historical context of those issues. And it's no coincidence, I'd argue, that regarding historical context, history and people within history are being cancelled or have been cancelled, because to actually engage with the nuance and the complexity of history is just too much effort, apparently. And it's only when you can cancel history and not explore the nuance that I think some of the cognitive dissonance exemplified in this banner can actually prosper. For most rational people, I'd suggest this cognitive dissonance, this self-contradiction in the theme of that banner, would just be too much. but apparently not for some. And it just reminds me, I came across this image. And one thing, maybe I apologise in advance if I'm being completely thick, but the tism in me immediately spotted the spelling error in kernel. And I don't know whether that's done deliberately or there's some in-joke or whatever. So apologies, I'm slightly tired today, I might have missed any subtlety. But that set me thinking, the idea that, again, going back to my experience at university, marking endless essays, and the extent to which the complete contradiction that never has a cohort of students been availed of so much technology, something as simple as spell checks. And yet that's coincided with, I witnessed it over 20, 30 years, the gradual decline in the student's ability to write, and spelling just became completely optional. And that coexistence of the technology that allowed you theoretically never to submit an essay with a spelling mistake ever again, and actually the increase in spelling mistake and the increase in the inability of students to spell for themselves, so reliant were they upon the technology of spell check that they never actually used properly. That struck me as a parallel with the internet being such an amazing resource, and yet people's thinking at the same time has atrophied. So it's this paradox whereby never have we been so technologically blessed, and yet the rhetoric of how it will expand our minds and give us tools that we've never had before seems to coexist with diminishing intellectual capability, because we become so lazy and sclerotic intellectually. But anyway, this was who I've looked at in the Charlie Kirk themed video, Rene Girard, and I've included in the description a link to a PDF of the whole text of this book, which, if you have the time, is well worth looking into. And I thought it might be quite interesting, given that identity politics in particular tends to view everything in the world as socially constructed. So gender, for example, is a social construct. We can all decide what our own gender is. I think implicit in this book is the concept that the way in which identity politics itself works is socially constructed, and there are various mechanisms. I thought it would be interesting to apply the notion of social construction back at the very people most likely to use it themselves unreflexively. And there are two main elements I'm going to look at. A key theme in Girard's work is the concept of scapegoating, so that will be mentioned, but it's, I think, in modern times, it would take future videos to explore it in proper depth. But I think scapegoating, as it was traditionally known, as happened to Job, the idea of an innocent victim being persecuted by this crowd of like-minded, unanimous opponents and people picking on them and using the scapegoat to vent their frustration and resentment. That's there have been alterations in some of the aspects of that, as we'll see when I mentioned there are victimhood has been almost reverse engineered. So rather than genuine victims being subjected to a process of scapegoating, victimhood has been claimed as some virtue status, and aspects of mainstream society that in the past might have been the persecutors are actually in some weird way becoming the persecuted. So that's one aspect, scapegoating. The other aspect is the notion of ritual, and how scapegoating tends to be the spontaneous outbreak of psychic energy in a crowd or a society, whereas over time some of these outbreaks get transformed into rituals, and sometimes the two things coexist. So I'd suggest the recent, I was going to say plague, I don't know what the collective noun is for annoying protests, but there's a ritualistic element to a lot of these protests, and also some spontaneity, and it's interesting the dynamic between those two qualities. So again, all the quotes from now on, unless you're told otherwise, are from Girard's book, Job, the Victim of His People. In a world controlled by, and I'm giving you now the full quote to the early epigraph, in a world controlled by mimetic desire, all individuals tend to banish each other, and therefore themselves, to some kind of desert. If we observe this secret relationship between individual situations, the identical alienation in everyone that isolates each one of us, then it is not hard to understand that the appetite for violence may grow and may ultimately be satisfied at that moment when the global tendency to uniformity focuses the mimetic substitutions and polarizations on some victim or other, or perhaps not so randomly, but on a victim who is more vulnerable because of his visibility, one who is somehow predestined by the exceptional position he holds in the community, someone like Job. So I'm going to keep coming back to Girard. I've had at least one comment saying that they wanted more Girard, so I'll just pretend that was hundreds of people because I've got a selfish interest and I just find Girard's work fascinating. But this idea of mimetic desire, he did a brilliant book. Is it called something like Desire, Deceit, and the Novel, which is all about narratives in novels across, I think he uses people like Dostoevsky and a lot of 19th century references. But the idea of how desire is a triangular, I call it the Toblerone theory of desire, where it's you, an object of your desire, and an obstacle, someone who might be able to stop you, and that generates extra desire because you have an obstacle to overcome. And he traces all that in an absolutely amazing book about the way in which that pattern is constantly repeated in various novels. Novels are arguably one of the best ways to understand the psychology of mimetic desire. And the concept of mimetic, just the adjective for, imitation or copying. And then I've italicized and emboldened these phrases myself, but this idea that the global tendency to uniformity focuses the mimetic substitutions and polarizations on some victim or another. And I think that's what we're witnessing at the moment. This global tendency to uniformity is one of the aspects of the mass marches and protests we're seeing. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along, because my argument would be there are various protests, various marches on seemingly disparate themes or political projects, when actually I would suggest that they are the manifestation of a global tendency to uniformity. And this is just to remind you of William Blake, who I'm going to go back to because I've used the Butt set of watercolours, and I'm going to do another talk eventually on Blake that will use his Linnell set. But these were some earlier engravings, which I think this was the first one of Job. And I just like the detail. The so-called friends, the people who berate him, are supposed to be comforting him at one stage, but the look in their eyes. And then that's the later, even more detailed version. I think I prefer the first one, but there you go. And then back to Girard's book. This is the origin of the violent sacred, a phenomenon that is much too common in human societies and too closely implicated in cultural, social, and political events, and in the most concrete technical operations, to be dismissed as superstition or collective neurosis, as positivism and psychoanalysis, respectively, have done. So he's talking about the violent sacred, the idea of there are these violent eruptions of people looking for scapegoats, which I'd suggest is an element of what's going on at the moment. And he's describing, and this is a theme throughout the book, the way in which Girard himself traces some of these phenomena right back to the archetypal practices of early human beings. And I find that interesting because if you look about you at the moment, I think any reasonable person reading the newspaper, watching the TV, etc., there's a almost palpable sense of things just being so disjointed and I'm trying to think of words that don't sound overly emotional, like, insane or mad as a box of frogs, but there just seems to be something in the air or in the water that is febrile, perhaps, might not be a bad phrase, fevered, just very odd. And these periodic outbursts, Girard, one of the advantages of his theories is they allow you to see them in a vast historical context. To repeat, it's this notion of Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. These things have happened before and they'll happen again, but sometimes we get lost in our own specific cultural situation and we don't see the patterns. So the scapegoat mechanism was pure spontaneity. From the point at which it is programmed from beginning to end, it ceases inevitably to be itself. Ritual imitation is the exact opposite of spontaneity. The greater its triumph, the more the ritual becomes the purely mechanical, sterile, and dead activity we call rite. So I'm flagging this up because Girard himself is making the distinction between spontaneity and then when the ritual of these spontaneous marches, they obviously lose their spontaneity the more they happen and the more ritualized they become. And then eventually, as he says, the ritual becomes the purely mechanical, sterile, and dead activity we call rite. Now, in certain religious forms, rituals and rites, because they're informed by theology and because they're informed by a whole background of complex, nuanced practices, there's still... So I'm thinking of the Catholic Mass. It can be mechanical and it's obviously a ritual, but there's a lot behind it that that can help you not just treat it as a purely mechanical thing. But intellectually, when these protests just become a ritualistic form, it begs the question, if there wasn't much thought going in, it was more emotion than thought going into why you're on a march in the first place. And I'll talk about that in a second, because I'm not trying to necessarily say a lot of these people on marches are completely ignorant, but I think it's pretty easy to prove that on certain marches, I'll explain more of this in a second, people aren't particularly well informed often, beyond a certain inchoate sense that there's something wrong in the world and they've joined this march. But you can see so many vox pops when people actually ask them about the specifics of the protest they're on. They don't know basic elements of information about the situation. So I think there's a strong reason to argue that a lot of these marches are informed more by emotion and senses of political injustice that aren't particularly well informed by knowledge. And I like this phrase, so I've italicized it and emboldened it, from Girard: the tyranny of fashion, political, cultural and professional life, the sexual parades, so obviously things like pride marches, constantly reproduce combinations of idolatry and ostracism that, though less violent, are identical in structure with what we learn about in the words of Job. And why I find those phrases interesting, the tyranny of fashion, political, cultural and professional life, I'm beginning to explore in future videos the notion of what I'm going to call the new totalitarianism. So if you look back over history, there was obviously the rise of fascism. On the flip side, you had the rise of the Soviet Union and communism around the world. And I never visited Eastern Europe during the Cold War, but very shortly afterwards I spent time in east of the Czech Republic in a place called Olomouc, a little town in the middle of nowhere, and also in Poland, in Warsaw, and where was it? Krakow. And I spent quite a while, and it was, what I found absolutely fascinating was they'd moved on and they were no longer living under communism, but there were little hints of it still. So just one little example in Olomouc, I remember eating every time out at lunch, and the menus were incredibly basic. There were photographs, so not speaking Czech wasn't a problem at all, you just pointed, but it was very limited choice. They had a certain way of doing things, and that was the way it would be done. I think there was McDonald's in the town that had only just arrived, and it was this hinge point when you could see how a previously totalitarian way of living was slowly opening up. And it also reminded me along these lines, I once saw a documentary about it was an ex-Soviet state, I've forgotten which one, and communism had ended, and they were trying to teach the people about the beginnings of capitalism as they embraced that model. So they wanted to have a soap opera based upon a kiosk to show people how capitalism basically worked. And they got people from a UK TV series called EastEnders to visit. And it was fascinating because the people who came to visit, the soap opera writers from the UK, had this incredibly patronising view. They were there to show these, barbarians how it was done. And yet, although they'd lived in a totalitarian system, they were the people they were talking to who were going to be making this ex-Soviet state new soap opera. Those people were incredibly well developed on an individualistic level, and a notion of authenticity I spoke about in the previous video. They played the guitar at night and they chatted about literature and Dostoevsky, these type of things. And it was just fascinating. You saw in the documentary, the English people were sat around saying, what's all this about? And they couldn't really relate at an intellectual level to these people they were supposed to be showing how to make this TV program. And I think one of the interviewees from this ex-Soviet state was basically saying, although life was pretty bad under communism, one of the positive aspects was you knew who your enemy was, you knew what you were rebelling against, and there were always private moments and aspects of your life that the totalitarian government didn't control. And those were quite precious parts of your life. Whereas in the West, I think we take for granted so much, but we also fail to realise the extent to which our life is this tyranny of fashion, political, cultural and professional life. There's a type of totalitarianism sneaks in through the back door, and we take for granted that we live in a free environment, and increasingly I think it should be obvious that's not necessarily true. And I just think this is a wonderful image. If you think of, without getting all nostalgic and Little Englander, the British Parliament as the mother of Parliament it's been referred to. And in recent times, basic things like free speech have been massively under threat, which is interesting because on all these banners you have the word free. But it's also flags from a country thousands of miles away, which, when we're talking about Intifada Chic, an intifada, to the best of my knowledge, means rebellion or resistance. The choice of that particular rebellion to invest emotionally in, of all the possible conflicts around the world, that's what there are many aspects that are interesting about an image like that, but that's one of the aspects, the way in which the groundswell, and it's become chic to wear the keffiyeh, the Palestinian scarf, which I always remember when cornrows in people's hair who weren't black were viewed as cultural appropriation, and there was big arguments about that. But apparently wearing the keffiyeh isn't a cultural appropriation. The rules seem to change. And then you have back to this idea that gay people support Palestine, whereas I'm not so sure the sentiment is reciprocal. And then this idea of social conformity or social contagion, to pick up on the analysis that you can find in Girard's book. This is an image of London, and at the time of the BLM protests, and some cynics have suggested BLM stands for Buy Large Mansions, which might be a commentary on what happened to some of the, quite a large proportion of the money that went to this organisation. Call me cynical. I just think it's an interesting image. You've got the lions at Trafalgar Square, and you've got a massive protest based upon events that happened thousands of miles away in America, which again goes to the potential motivation, the idea of fashion, which was the previous Rene Girard quote, the viral meme-like effect of BLM that had very direct effects in the UK. So this is a picture of Edward Colston. I mentioned the cancelling of history before, but in 2020 in Bristol, Edward Colston statue, he was associated with the slave trade in the late 1600s, I think. So in a paroxysm of BLM influenced atmosphere in the UK at the time, his statue was torn down and thrown into the river. And interestingly, and this is just one of the way in which, I'll give you examples in a second, the way the political establishment responds to protests in different ways is an indication of the way in which the mechanism of scapegoating or reverse scapegoating actually takes place in Western democracies. So then I'm giving you just examples of all the different types of protests that have sprung up. And I just particularly like the person with the megaphone, which looks like a the whole ensemble, sartorial ensemble, looks like that of a professional protester, complete with the badge bedecked beret. And then you've got the endless differentiation downwards of the various subsects. And it reminds me of the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, where he talks about the Popular People's Front of Judea. And he goes, bastards, it's not. It's the Judean Popular People's Front that we're a member of or whatever. As the gag is that it just becomes so schismatic. And then the whole climate change protests interest me because science in the climate change context is all important, despite the fact that I'd be intrigued to know this is a very young person, this was a school protest, but the amount of qualified climate scientists or people in that crowd who know anything about climate science to any decent scientific degree. I know very little about climate change. I'm not pro or against, I'm very ignorant about it. So I've got an open mind, climate change agnostic. So it interests me the people who have incredibly strong views. And yet these same people, I'm guessing, a large percentage when it comes to issues about gender identity would dismiss the science and say that gender is a social construct. But apparently climate change isn't. Again, it's just unclear to me when the rules apply and when they don't. And then you've got I would start it, and I might finish it a bit like Magnus Magnuson, but I started doing something on Graham Linehan. For those that you who know about Father Ted, the TV series, the creator of Father Ted was a couple of weeks ago arrested at Heathrow Airport for tweets he'd made in the past, and he was arriving from America. So talk about chilling effect. Basically, American citizens aren't necessarily safe when they arrive at Heathrow Airport. But in Father Ted, my memory's failing me, but I'm pretty sure that the plot line was they were sent by a higher up in the church to protest a film, I think it was called The Passion of St. Tibulus or something. And this was the sign they had with them, down with this sort of thing. And it's Graham Linehan making fun of just the general act of protesting. But even that gets co-opted. So at various protests around the world, down with this sort of thing has become adopted. It's lost its Graham Linehan's critical, satirical edge that he was using it for. And it's become co-opted and absorbed into protest movements themselves. So to go back to the actual Book of Job, I have become a byword among the people, and a creature on whose face to spit. My eyes grow dim with grief, and my limbs wear away like a shadow. At this honest men are shocked, and the guiltless man rails against the godless. Just men grow more settled in their ways. Those whose hands are clean add strength to strength. So that's the section, and he's quite open. Rene Girard says that this is based upon the Jerusalem Bible translation, and he says that's the translation that most suits his argument, so obviously he's adopted that. But he points out this is a second version of the second stanza, and this is the New English Bible. And the distinction Girard makes is that in the first, the Jerusalem Bible translation, the scapegoat mechanism that's being referred to, this is Job complaining, that the mechanism reinforces, it acts as a socially cohesive force. The people persecuting the scapegoat, the strength of that social bond, it says that the hands are clean and add strength to strength. Whereas in the second version, the strengthening takes place not because of the scapegoat mechanism, but despite. And one of Girard's points is the scapegoat mechanism is a very complex thing that's taken place throughout human culture, and it gets submerged. He argues he's found various ways as he analyses various texts to show how it's reflected in cultural output like literature. But he also suggests that it's also not being covered up in any conspiracy-like way. But this just shows, the example he gives here of these two different interpretations shows the extent to which these things can become submerged over time as different interpretations become more prominent than others. And then he gives a fascinating, well, I find it fascinating, see what you think, further analysis. And this is why when I do the live stream on An Agnostic Guide to the Bible, I've got someone who is a biblical specialist to help. So this is a line from the previous quote: "A creature on whose face to spit." According to Etienne Dorme, a literal translation would read, "I will be a public Tophet." Dorme indicates in a footnote that for the commentator Ibn Ezar, the word Tophet is composed of two terms. In the first place, the valley of the Tophet, a place of shame according to Jeremiah, since it is where the Judeans practiced human sacrifice, which was forbidden by Yahweh. They made their sons and daughters go through the fire. Tophet may also mean altar or hearth. The Jews read this word with the vowels of the word boshet, which means shame. And maybe I'll be discussing this on the Agnostic Guide to the Bible playlist, the way in which written Hebrew has, in early biblical texts, the vowels aren't shown, so you have stems of words that are the consonants. So it creates these type of plays on words and various associations that I don't think you'd get in English. Our translation establishes a direct connection between the persecution of the innocent and the consolation of good citizens. That goes back to the previous distinction between the two types of translation. The strengthening of the social order. This connection is so scandalous that many people simply refuse to consider it. If we telescope the two terms, combining the vowels of one with the consonants of the second, we get Tophet. The public Tophet, in this case a man, is an object of unanimous execration, that is to say, a scapegoat. I see no difference between the two expressions. There is no ambiguity. Despite the numerous tricks language plays on us, I see no reason to complain of its inability to communicate unambiguous meanings. I just think it's fascinating that the derivation of Tophet. So like a bolt of lightning, the scapegoat mechanism suddenly frees all men without being answerable to anyone, except perhaps to the victim himself, who's likely to become an idol after his disappearance. No one can control or manipulate the mechanism. It bears all the marks of a supernatural intervention. Everything about it suggests a power that transcends wretched humanity. It is the prototype of every sacred epiphany. So Girard's talking about, and I find this incredibly useful for understanding what lies behind the weird social atmosphere at the moment. What are the undercurrents fueling people's behaviour that seems to be often so irrational? And the way Girard describes the scapegoating mechanism, he phrases like a bolt of lightning, all the marks of a supernatural intervention. He's suggesting it's a very real sociological phenomenon, but its actual causes, as I referred to earlier on, are submerged. They're not openly available for self-reflection quite often. People get caught up in this process, a power that transcends wretched humanity. It's the prototype of every sacred epiphany. And I'd argue today you've got it even in a more complex form, because previous cultures have had more, ironically, given that they're less sophisticated technologically, they had more sophisticated ways of dealing with things like sacred epiphany. So I keep referring back to Nietzsche's notion of the birth of tragedy, and how he argues that the ancient Greeks were the absolute apotheosis, the supreme limit of theatre and drama, when they produced brilliant tragedies that involved the music, the Greek chorus, the atmosphere of a auditorium that I think I've shown pictures of in previous videos. The sun set and you're watching in semi-darkness these performances that have all these different elements beautifully combined, and the subject matter is tragic. So it has existential human condition thrown into the mix. So they had a way of processing what otherwise might seem to be all the marks of a supernatural intervention. They had highly sophisticated cultural forms for dealing with some of these underlying processes that exist in society, and ironically we don't. So people get caught up in this, what I think Durkheim referred to as collective effervescence, when they're in a crowd. And this is from Union Park Square, a picture of the George Floyd statue. And again, this is from the Girard book. The undeserved suffering and downfall of a victim contributes to the good behaviour of his fellow men. It becomes a principle of moral edification, a miraculous tonic for the social body. The pharmakos now becomes the pharmakon. The surrogate victim is transformed into a marvellous drug, dangerous but in moderate doses capable of curing all illnesses. Had Job been willing to play his role docilely, he would undoubtedly soon have been made into a great man, perhaps even a minor divinity. So I don't want to go too much into the politics of the whole George Floyd thing, but just to say that the way in which what interests me is it's thousands of miles away from the UK, but as I've already shown you, it had a direct impact. And this reference, pharmakos, is the scapegoat. And I think I've got this right. Pharmakos is the Greek word for the scapegoat, but pharmakon, it shares the same root of the notion of a drug. So it's where we get the word pharmacy from. And Derrida, from memory, did a whole paper, complex paper on this. But this idea that the way in which people get turned into, and I think with George Floyd it occurred, this minor divinity. But this goes back to this, as I referred earlier to, it's almost reverse scapegoating, in the sense that the person being purportedly persecuted by the establishment is turned around, and that victim's status is used back to persecute the establishment in a strange, very contemporary form. So I'm trying to say this in a non-controversial way. What I'm just trying to point out is he became a minor divinity to groups like BLM, but at the very least you could suggest it was a more nuanced, complicated argument what actually went on with the whole George Floyd movement. And But this idea that it largely becomes irrespective what the initial cause is, because the way in which an individual gets turns into the divinity, a minor divinity, is part of the scapegoat process, whether it's in reverse in modern times or the more old-fashioned Old Testament version. But I just like this. It's obviously the very close association of pharmakos and pharmakon, but this notion of a marvelous drug on the social body, it has this potentially pacifying effect or stimulating effect. And then it goes on how this mechanism works. The community needs self-confident men to prevent it, the violence that is, from spreading randomly within the community, steering it towards the best victim, one who is most likely to attract unanimous opposition. This victim may be singled out beforehand in the eyes of the envious and the malcontent by exceptional success and extraordinary responsibilities, and is thus already a victim targeted for divine anger. That's just a random collection of people who annoy me in the media. In terms of the community needs self-confident men. These are the voices, the talking heads, the commentariat that push people towards these various scapegoating processes. And maybe I'm now scapegoating the scapegoaters, so I'm guilty of it too. Beneath the attitude of the friends, so this is the friends talking, berating Job, and you could dispute to what extent they qualified as friends. We sense their willingness to go along with the phenomenon and imitate all the actions which have previously led to its successful outcome. Its most desirable orientation must be maintained, and this would appear from all the evidence to be its present one. This is the primary purpose of the passionate speeches about the celestial armies. What I'm describing is ritual inspiration. So just to explain, in the previous video of the Charlie Kirk theme, when I quoted sections from the Book of Job where those berating Job, saying his so-called friends are basically saying you're guilty because why else would God be punishing you? And they refer to the ancient trail that Girard emphasizes, this place that wicked people have walked before and they've been punished by these celestial armies of God. And Girard points out that being able to refer to the celestial armies of God is a way of making your position as the persecutor more self-righteous and divine. So you're justified in persecuting somebody. And this happens, as we've seen, when people have gone after figures like J.K. Rowling and death threats and all sorts of horrible behaviour, but they justify their behaviour by the modern equivalent of these celestial armies, these online trolls. But interesting, what I've italicized there is the most desirable orientation must be maintained. This, it's almost like a oxymoron. It's a radical, something's radical's happening, but it's in quite a predictable ritualistic pattern. So some of the new-found ideologies that are dominating public discourse these days, they can be quite radical, so gender identification, but the purity of the dogma has to be maintained. The most desirable orientation must be maintained. And that aspect of the dogmatic nature, that there will be no deviation from the new accepted truth. So biology for a couple of thousand years was patently apparent to most people, but overnight almost the new dogma comes down, and there is a process whereby that dogma and the purity of the new interpretation is maintained. And then to give you another example, so this is a illustration of the UK grooming gang scandal, which I'd argue is one of the worst scandals and hasn't, although it's had some belated media attention, nowhere near the level of media attention it should have had. But I just won't say too much, but just show you again quotes from the Girard book that actually show how relevant to modern developments some of the analysis of the Book of Job can be. So in societies where human sacrifice is practiced, orphans are the chosen victims. The sacrifice of a child whose parents are living runs the risk of making enemies of them. The ideal victim, the being who has no relatives, servants, neighbours, nor even a friend to defend him. And in the UK case, a lot of the abused girls were from care homes. They were parentless or estranged from their family, going through a rough period, whatever, and these were the girls who were targeted. In Job's eyes, the three friends are trafficking in human flesh. They seem honourable, and they are honourable from their own perspective, that of their religious system. But in the universe Job has entered, they remind us of somewhat shady experts who have the necessary skill and knowledge to carry out the most sordid affairs without attracting any attention. And I just love the somewhat shady experts who have the necessary skill and knowledge to carry out the most sordid affairs. And the picture you're seeing is two prominent members of the UK government, female members obviously, who went out of their way to try, and they failed, but they tried to stop a national inquiry into the grooming gangs and offered all types of excuses. And I just love this quote from the Book of Job. As for you, you are only charlatans, physicians in your own estimation. So the idea of shady experts and charlatans who, in their own estimation, think of themselves as physicians, I think is a great description of politicians of whatever colour of the political spectrum in most countries. But I just think that the three friends of Job are, the way Girard describes them, as trafficking in human flesh. These are the sorts of politicians who made excuses for the people who actually did trade in human flesh. So this is one UK politician, Jess Phillips, who prides herself on being quite an emotional representative of vulnerable women and girls, who was part of the attempted delaying and borderline cover-up. So again, this is Girard's text. There should not be any improper details, but there are, and mysteriously, they are always arranged by those people who appear so reliable and worthy of confidence, clearly marked for this sort of undertaking. No doubt because in reality, they are not in the least bit reliable and worthy of confidence. The current desire to respect differences, which is a phrase you constantly hear, the whole basis of identity politics, reaches the point of putting all truths on the same level. It basically eliminates the very idea of truth, seeing it only as a source of conflict. But if we put the truth of the persecutors on the same level as the truth of the victim, there will very quickly be no difference or truth for anyone. The friends, i.e. of Job, are perfectly sincere, but their truth is the lynching of innocent people. It is also a mystification. The truth offered by Job is quite different. It's an unconditional, absolute truth. So this goes to the whole, and it's complicated, as we'll see in a second, by the modern version whereby victimhood is a status actively sought. But Girard suggesting that Job is an important text for the way it actually emphasises that it's a whole area that I've spoken in other forums about, but truth can be relative in ways that detractors of postmodernism often get wrong, I'd argue. But in this particular case, Girard's arguing there are certain forms of truth that aren't particularly negotiable, and we risk losing that ironically, through this, the current desire to respect differences reaches the point of putting all truths on the same level. Whereas Job is important because Job is one of these people, I don't really like the phrase, it's overused, but who speaks truth to power. Job is one of those rare people who, in a bureaucracy, for example, will say, no, this is wrong. This is immorality hiding behind process. Whereas with the grooming gang scandal, for example, so many major politicians have hid behind process. They haven't adopted the voice of Job. It's not enough to recognise the object of the debate, the collective violence that is about to descend on Job and already affects him. We must also recognise the two perspectives on this violence and, more importantly, choose between them. Avoiding participation is deception. Again, I suggest that's highly relevant to the UK grooming gang scandal. Any pretense at impassiveness, whether stoic, philosophic, or scientific, perpetuates the status quo, prolongs the occulting of the scapegoat, and makes us effective accomplices of the persecutors. Job is the opposite of this impassiveness. Far from being a source of ignorance, his passionate identification with the victim is the authentic source of knowledge as well as everything else. The true science of man is not indifferent. And I have to stop myself going on and on about this, but I just love this concept of Girard's analysis of impassiveness. It would be interesting how many viewers have had direct experience themselves of having seen something in an organisational context that you think is deeply immoral and just plain wrong. And if you try and whistleblow or raise attention to it, you either suffer as an individual for being the whistleblower, or there will be a whole response, an institutional response based upon stock lines, impassive stock lines, along the lines of statements like, we have followed all due process. It's always the emphasis upon process. So a moral question is being asked and a technical answer is given back. But the last sentence, the true science of man is not indifferent. It's not about process. It's not about having followed all the right procedures. It's a basic question of right or wrong. And that's what Job, who is the opposite of this impassiveness, represents. In our day, certain aspects of this knowledge, the knowledge of the victim, are too vulgarised not to be sullied and perverted, not to become the paradoxical instrument of a more subtle persecution. The unique character of modern times is revealed in the fact that, in the competition for public opinion, the position of the victim is now the most desirable. It's no longer the ancient posture of a suppliant struggling to arouse pity, but a claim for legal and even extra-legal rights. This unique situation is a product of biblical influence, but resentment is merely an illegitimate heir, certainly not the father of Judeo-Christian scripture. So this relates to what I was saying earlier on about, in modern times, there is this weird adaptation or reverse engineering of the scapegoat mechanism, which I think Girard describes better than I could here. And I think Girard's just suggesting that this is what we need to keep our eye on, because it's not the legitimate heir of what is contained within Judeo-Christian scripture. And then just to start finishing off, what's interesting is the way in which images, icons relating to the scapegoat mechanism gets, as you can see here, there was vandalism inflicted on the George Floyd statue. And this is recently within this last week in London, a Gandhi statue was vandalised in London. So in both cases, the point is that these images of purported victims or representatives of various values in our society are still being fought over. So for many people, Gandhi would be the absolute epitome of a symbol of peace and peaceful resistance. Yeah, the times I mentioned earlier on are so febrile that even someone like Gandhi is the target of the purity of the dogmatic response. So then you ask yourself, where's all this leading? And in the British case, we had the situation where the police were taking the knee in a BLM type way, again, just to emphasise, for events that were happening thousands of miles away. And I just find this, irrespective of the rights and wrongs of the whole George Floyd thing, the way in incident, the way in which this, the tyranny of fashion or the meme-like nature of an ideology can actually affect an institution you would think would be more immune to it. So this was the police, and then this was, I'm pretty sure at the time these were the opposition. So the shadow leader, the leader of the Labour Party, and his deputy leader, who are now, she's just lost her job for various shenanigans relating to property, but he is still, at the time of this video at least, the British Prime Minister. But submitting to this, what I've started the whole talk by labelling as Intifada Chic. To repeat this, the tyranny of fashion, in an ideological sense, I think is deeply alarming. And I'll just finish with one last image of, I've spent a lot of time on the Book of Job and the way in which the ancient biblical writing can have contemporary relevance. So I just thought I'd finish on a slightly lighter but quite succinct note with a final image. But I hope you enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best.